This evening, I will be taking you back to the intrigues of the court of Henry VIII, reading from Philippa Gregory's novel, The Other Boleyn Girl, which tells the story of the rise and fall of King Henry's second of 6 wives, Anne Boleyn, from the point of view of her younger sister, Mary. In the years before Henry divorces Catherine of Aragon, Mary becomes the king's mistress, although she herself was married at the time, only to be eclipsed by Anne. In this scene, Mary and Anne discuss the high-stakes issue with their older brother George, who ultimately was implicated in conspiring in Anne's adultery, leading to the execution of both of them. Anne slipped into the routine of the English court and waited for her wedding. She still had not yet met her husband, and the arguments about the dowry and settlements looked as if they would take forever. Not even the influence of Cardinal Wolsey, who had his finger in this, as well as every other pie in the bakehouse of England, could speed the business along. In the meantime, she flirted as elegantly as a Frenchwoman, served the king's sister with nonchalant grace, and squandered hours every day in gossiping, riding, and playing with George and me. We were alike in tastes and not far apart in age. I was the baby at 14 to Anne's 15 and George's 19 years. We were the closest of kin, and yet almost strangers. I had been at the French court with Anne, while George had been learning his trade as a courtier in England. Now, reunited, we became known around the court as the 3 Boleyns, the 3 delightful Boleyns. And the king would often look round when he was in his private rooms and cry out for the 3 Boleyns, and someone would be sent running from one end of the castle to fetch us. Our first task in life was to enhance the king's many entertainments: jousting, tennis, riding, hunting, hawking, dancing. He liked to live in a continual roar of excitement, and it was our duty to ensure that he was never bored. But sometimes, very rarely, in the quiet time before dinner, or if it rained and he could not hunt, he would find his own way to the Queen's apartments, and she would put down her sewing or her reading and send us away with a word. If I lingered, I might see her smile at him, in a way that she never smiled at anyone else, not even at her daughter, the Princess Mary. And once, when I had entered, without realizing the king was there, I found him seated at her feet like a lover, his head tilted up to rest in her lap, as she brushed the red gold curls from his forehead and twisted them around her fingers, where they glowed as bright as the rings he had given her when she had been a young princess with hair as bright as his, and he had married her against the advice of everyone. I tiptoed away without them seeing me. It was so rare that they were alone together, and I did not want to be the one to break the spell. I went to find Anne. She was walking in the cold garden with George, a bunch of snowdrops in her hand, and her cloak wrapped tightly about her. "The king is with the Queen," I said as I joined them, "on their own." Anne raised an eyebrow. "In bed?" she she asked curiously. I flushed. Of course not, it's 2 in the afternoon. Anne smiled at me. You must be a happy wife if you think you can't bed before nightfall. George extended his other arm to me. She is a happy wife, he said on my behalf. William was telling the king that he had never known a sweeter girl. But what were they doing, Mary? Just sitting together, I said. I had a strong feeling that I did not want to describe the scene to Anne. She won't get a son that way, Anne said crudely. Hush, George and I said. At once the 3 of us drew a little closer and lowered our voices. She must be losing hope of it, George said. What is she now? 38? 39? Only 37, I said indignantly. Does she still have her monthly courses? Oh, George! Yes, she does, Anne said matter-of-factly. But little good they do her. It's her fault. It can't be laid at the king's door with this bastard from Bessie Blunt learning to ride his pony. There's still plenty of time, I said defensively. Time for her to die and him to remarry? Anne said thoughtfully. Yes, and she's not strong, is she? Anne! For once my recoil from her was genuine. That's vile! George glanced around once more to make sure that there was no one near us in the garden. A couple of Seymour girls were walking with their mother, but we paid no attention to them. Their family were our chief rivals for power and advancement. We liked to pretend not to see them. It's vile, but it's true, he said bluntly. Who's to be the next king if he doesn't have a son? Princess Mary could marry, I suggested. A foreign prince brought in to rule England? It'd never hold, George said. And we can't tolerate another war for the throne. Princess Mary could become queen in her own right, and not marry, I said wildly. Rule as queen on her own. Anne gave a snort of disbelief, her breath a little cloud on the cold air. Oh, aye, she said deliberately, derisively. She could ride astride and learn to joust. A girl can't rule a country like this. The great lords would eat her alive. The 3 of us paused before the fountain that stood in the centre of the garden. Anne, with a well-trained grace, sat on the rim of the basin and looked into the water. As she pulled off her embroidered glove and dabbled her long fingers in the water, a few goldfish swam hopefully toward her. They came up, little mouths gaping, to nibble at the air. George and I watched her as she watched her own rippling reflection. Does the king think of this? She asked her mirrored reflection. Constantly, George answered. There's nothing in the world more important. I think he'd legitimize Bessie Blunt's boy and make him heir if there's no issue from the Queen. A bastard on the throne? He wasn't christened Henry Fitzroy for no reason, George replied. He's acknowledged as the king's own son. If Henry lives long enough to make the country safe for him, if he can get the Seymours to agree and us Howards, if Wolsey gets the church behind him and the foreign powers, what should stop him? One little boy, and he a bastard, Anne said thoughtfully. One little girl of 6, one elderly queen, and a king in the prime of his life. She looked up at the 2 of us, dragging her gaze away from her own pale face in the water. What's going to happen? She asked. Something has to happen. What's it going to be? Mr. Toastmaster.